Okay, so the focus of my talk is China's international energy strategy. But first, as I say, I'm going to look at the domestic side briefly, then go to the international side, and I want to look at three questions. What is China doing internationally? Why is it doing it? And briefly at the end, what is the outlook? This is a curve that I hope you can see clearly. If not, you have paper copies of. On the vertical scale, there is energy consumption or production and time along the bottom from 1980 to 2006. And you can see two lines, the green line at the top, which is consumption, and the blue line at the bottom, which is production. And you can see quite clearly two things. First is that China now consumes more energy than it produces. And second, that the rate of consumption of energy has increased in the last few years compared to the 80s and 90s. But what is more worrying for the world and for the Chinese government is the trends in energy intensity. As you can see, during the 1980s and 1990s, energy intensity in China was falling consistently, and this was a great achievement. But from 2002, there was a reversal of this trend, and energy intensity started to rise, which is why from 2004 and 2005, they started to put in place a vigorous program of energy conservation, which is the topic of one of the papers that I sent around. And in the last 2 years, we've seen some reduction in that energy intensity. So as I say, from 2006 to 2008, there was a 10% reduction in energy intensity, and they're looking for a further 10% intensity. First is the slowness and the unwillingness to use economic incentives, such as pricing and taxing. Second is the slowness to integrate with other policies, industrial policy, economic policy, exchange rate policy, monetary policy, bank policy, social security policy, and other forms of policy. The third is the challenge in the political and administrative systems, because China, like Brazil, is a federal country, but in China they have 4 or 5 levels of administration. And it's extremely tough getting policies invented at the top, pushed all the way down through to the bottom. The fourth issue is technical skills, both within government, particularly local government, and within companies. There's a real shortage of people who really understand how to develop and implement energy policy relating to energy efficiency. And the final issue, which I'm uncertain about, is current public attitudes to energy efficiency and clean energy in China. And in fact, in a month's time, I go to China to carry out some pilot surveys of public opinion as to what they think about energy efficiency and green energy. And the final question mark relates to the current economic stimulus package that we see in China. If you'd asked me a year ago, I would have said I was optimistic about continued progress in energy efficiency in China. But if we look at the economic stimulus package that's been rolled out since November, then we will see it is very heavily comprised of energy-intensive industries such as construction and infrastructure. So that I'm concerned that maybe we shall see a reversal of these improvements. I'm now going to move on to the focus of the talk, which is China's oil and gas challenges, particularly on the international scene. As you're all aware, demand for oil and gas is outstripping supply. China became a net importer of oil in 1994 and a net importer of gas in 2006. And these imports are set to rise for the foreseeable future, for the next 10, 20 years or so, depending if new fuels come in. But certainly the next 10 or 20 years, China is going to be a major importer of oil and gas. And if we look at the oil curve, we see the flat curve on the bottom, which is production, which is increasing at about 2% a year. We see the steeper curve, which is consumption. The gap is currently about 180 million tonnes per year, which is close to 4 million barrels a day. And this is due to double, maybe, over the next 5 to 8 years. Now, clearly the economic crisis will have an impact on that and may slow down the growth of the gap in the next 2 or 3 years, but after that, once the economy recovers, we expect the graph to continue upwards and the gap between supply and demand to continue to grow. Here I've summarized the key elements of China's oil strategy. On the left, the domestic elements, on the right, the overseas elements, and obviously we're going to focus on the overseas elements, but don't forget that China is putting huge efforts into maximizing domestic production of oil and of gas, oil refining capacity, domestic pipelines, ports and shipping to import the oil, building strategic oil storage. It's been working on coal to liquids and on biofuels, but using fuel consumption standards for motor vehicles. However, as any of you who've been to China will know, China encourages private road transport. You go to Beijing, there are 6 ring roads. If that is energy policy, then that is telling me that road transport is China's preferred energy policy. Although fuel prices and taxes have been raised recently, they are still relatively low, and so there isn't a strong incentive to save on oil consumption. And there is a huge amount of oil consumption and very inefficient oil consumption in the agricultural sector. But the focus of today's talk is on the overseas oil strategy. As with most countries, China seeks to diversify its imports. And if we look at this slide, we can see, if we go back to the mid-1990s on the left, then about 40% of the oil came from the Middle East, and almost all the rest came from the Asia Pacific, particularly Malaysia and Indonesia. That picture has changed dramatically. The Middle East still is important at 45%, but Africa has moved up to at least 30%. Asia Pacific has almost disappeared, and Eurasia, that's mainly Kazakhstan and Russia, is starting to form a significant part of China's oil imports. So China has been very successful at diversifying its sources of imports. It's also maximizing the import of crude oil compared to oil products, because it wants to hold as much refining capacity as possible and refine the oil itself. It builds long-term diplomatic relationships with the oil suppliers, as in the Middle East, in Africa and in Latin America, and has long-term supply contracts. And as you will have observed, is building a number of overland import